We are diving straight into one of the most consequential and frankly brutal succession struggles in 20th century history. I mean, cast your mind back to the moment the Russian Revolution succeeded. Between 1917 and 1924, the Bolsheviks were facing this just impossible task.
It was an absolute crucible.
Right. They had to build an entirely new society while fighting a civil war, managing economic collapse, and somehow establishing legitimacy for a regime that had no blueprint.
An environment that, normalized extreme violence and demanded organizational effectiveness above pretty much all else.
And from that chaos, two monumental figures emerged.
Battling not just for control, but for the very soul of what the Soviet Union would become. Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin.
So we have this colossal political struggle stretching from the revolution's start right up until, well, Trotsky's dramatic assassination in 1940.
And our sources today, they aren't just revisiting history. They're using this rivalry as a kind of masterclass in authoritarian dynamics.
That's right. Our mission in this deep dive is to conduct a comparative analysis to understand precisely why Stalin, the organizational builder, prevailed over Trotsky.
The internationally famous revolutionary, the brilliant intellectual, it seems like a mismatch on paper.
It does. And then, crucially, we'll look at how that victory shaped 20th century communism and what lessons it offers for understanding, contemporary single-party states.
And it's not just academic history either.
No, not at all. The sources highlight three very specific contemporary concerns. First, there's the fundamental question of succession in authoritarian systems. If you look at non-democratic states today, how does power truly transfer when, informal networks and bureaucratic control just completely dominate any written rules?
And secondly, you see this ideological tension playing out globally even now. The split between, let's say, nationalist assertiveness, that's the Stalin model, versus the ambition of a global ideological project, which was Trotsky's model. When you look at current great power competition, China, Russia, these historical foundations are still clearly visible.
And finally, that fiercely debated question, the relationship between modernization and repression.
A huge one.
Can authoritarian systems, and people always cite China's rise here, achieve rapid development more efficiently than democracies? Stalin's crash industrialization is the original brutal test case for that argument.
So to tackle this, we're using three complementary frameworks. We'll look at the institutional side, who controlled the levers of the organization.
Then the ideological side, their competing visions.
And finally, a biographical analysis, how their wildly different personal traits and experiences influence the struggle.
Okay, let's start with the men themselves. Their apprenticeships were built in entirely different worlds. Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein in Ukraine, was the consummate cosmopolitan intellectual.
Absolutely. He mastered languages, he devoured theory, he spent his formative years in European exile, Vienna, Paris, London.
Soaking it all in.
Yeah, immersed in these sophisticated international socialist circles. And that experience fundamentally shaped him. He was the voice, the regime's leading orator.
And the architect of the Red Army. Let's not forget that. He transformed militias into a disciplined 5 million-man fighting force.
Through sheer personal will, really. He was the man of the public stage, of grand theory. Everyone knew his name.
Then you have Joseph Stalin, born Iosif Jugashvili in Georgia. He was forged in, poverty, violence, a rigid religious school.
His revolutionary experience wasn't in intellectual cafes. It was in the underground networks of the Caucasus. And that's where he developed an entirely different, and you could argue more durable, skill set.
Secrecy, intense organizational discipline.
And a total comfort with violence. I mean, this is a man who engaged in bank robberies to fund the Bolsheviks. Unlike Trotsky's exile, Stalin's deportations to Siberia were about survival and logistics, not philosophical debate.
So he occupied these less visible, but as it turns out, strategically vital roles, like the People's Commissar for Nationalities Affairs.
Exactly. He wasn't addressing rallies. He was quietly building personal networks by appointing lower-level officials who owed him everything.
So by 1922, the difference is just crystal clear. Trotsky has the enormous revolutionary prestige. He's Lenin's intellectual peer.
And Stalin holds the newly created general secretary position.
A role that looked, mundane, managing party paperwork, logistics. But that administrative control was about to prove absolutely pivotal.
It's the classic lesson, isn't it? While Trotsky was leading armies and writing manifestos, Stalin was controlling the meeting agendas and the personnel files?
He wasn't focused on grandeur, he was focused on appointments.
That's the key. But before that organizational machine really kicked in, they had to fight over the future direction of the ideology itself.
Which brings us to the core ideological contest. Trotsky's vision was permanent revolution.
Right. And the stakes of that idea were huge. Trotsky argued that socialism could not possibly survive in isolated, economically backward Russia.
He was surrounded by hostile capitalist powers.
Exactly. The revolution, in his view, wasn't a national event. It had to be continuous, international, immediately spreading to advanced industrial nations like Germany for resources and support. He had strong classical Marxist theory on his side for this.
But Stalin countered with a profoundly effective political slogan: socialism in one country.
Simple, clear, and immediately appealing. The idea was that we can and we must build a successful socialist state right here in the Soviet Union, independently of what happens elsewhere.
And this is where political reality just trumps intellectual theory.
It resonated immediately with two key groups. First, the war-weary population desperate for stability. And second, and maybe more importantly, it resonated most strongly with the new class of party officials.
Stalin's people.
Stalin's people. Their power, their security, their privileges depended entirely on the continued existence of the existing Soviet state, not some risky, hypothetical global uprising. It felt practical, nationalist, and safe.
So, if Trotsky had the charisma, the intellect, the history as Red Army chief, why did Stalin win? This is where that institutional analysis becomes paramount.
It was the systematic exploitation of the general secretary role. It was initially designed just for coordination. Stalin transformed it into the central node of all political power. The first step was personnel control.
He controlled all major and minor appointments throughout the entire party.
Down to the regional and local levels. He filled every single influential post with people who owed their careers directly and exclusively to him.
That's immense power. If you control who holds office, you don't have to convince them of your policy.
You just issue orders. And the second lever was information management. He controlled the flow of reports, decided who saw which policy drafts, and basically dictated how debates were framed within the bureaucracy.
You can't fight a political battle when your opponent controls the playing field, the rules, and the score.
It's a foundational lesson in any single-party state. Control over information and appointments is everything.
And the sources highlight a fantastic, specific detail of this strategy: the Lenin enrollment of 1924.
Right after Lenin's death. Precisely. The party admitted hundreds of thousands of new members, often uneducated workers, peasants, who were responsive to organizational authority, not to abstract ideological debates.
So it completely diluted the influence of Trotsky's intellectual allies.
And ensured the party machinery was populated by men loyal to the organization, which by now was synonymous with Stalin.
What's also just shocking is Stalin's sheer tactical flexibility. He was effectively playing political chess against his own side.
Pure political cynicism. He was a masterclass in it. In the first phase, roughly 1923 to 1925, he needed to neutralize Trotsky's prestige. So he allied with the old guard Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky.
Once Trotsky is isolated, phase 2.
Phase 2, 1925 to 1927. He allied with Bukharin on the party's right wing against his former allies Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had now teamed up with Trotsky. This ends with Trotsky's expulsion in 1927.
And then once they're all gone, he turns on his last remaining ally, Bukharin.
The third phase, 1928-29. He adopts these radical super-industrialization policies that were, ironically, more extreme than what Trotsky had even called for, crushing Bukharin and consolidating absolute personal control.
He just used rivals as stepping stones and discarded them.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the suppression of Lenin's testament here. This document, dictated in 22 and 23, was Lenin's final warning.
It was explicit. He said Stalin was too rude and urged comrades to think about a way of removing Stalin from that post.
He praised Trotsky too, though he did criticize his excessive self-assurance.
Right, so the testament was read to the Central Committee in May 1924, but it was immediately suppressed, never released to the public. But if it was so damaging to Stalin, why didn't Trotsky just leak it or press the issue?
And that's the core tragedy of Trotsky's political naivete. He genuinely believed that preserving the image of party unity was more important than exposing Stalin. He trusted that his own theoretical correctness would eventually win out.
So when Stalin offered a theatrical resignation,
the committee, which was already stacked with his appointees, unanimously urged him to stay. The moment passed. and Stalin's institutional grip became unbreakable.
And once that grip was solidified, the transformation of Soviet society began with, well, terrifying speed. Let's move to the consequences. The Industrial Revolution from above.
The first and second five-year plans. The goal was breathtaking, to transform an agrarian society into an industrial power within a single decade, and the quantitative achievements were massive.
Steel production, for instance, surged from 4 million tons in 1928 to 18 million by 1937.
They built cities and factories seemingly overnight, but the way they did it defines the Stalinist model.
Central planning, crashed technical education, and critically, the integration of forced labor camps, the Gulag, directly into the economic system.
A primary source of cheap, disposable labor for massive projects.
And the human cost started with collectivization, the forcible reorganization of peasant farming, beginning in 1929.
The state launched decolonization, targeting millions of so-called wealthy peasants, who were often just people who owned a few extra cows, leading to mass deportations and executions.
Resistance was met with state violence and requisition policies that prioritized feeding the cities over the peasants producing the food.
The consequence was a catastrophic man-made famine, especially in Ukraine, the Holodomor.
The death toll from the combined violence, deportation, starvation, it's estimated conservatively between 5 and 8 million people.
The mobilization was achieved, but at a staggering, unforgivable price. And the internal violence only escalated with the Great Terror between 1936 and 1938.
You hear about the Moscow show trials, where former rivals like Zinoviev and Bukharin were forced to confess to absurd charges. But the purge went so far beyond them.
The terror was comprehensive. It swept through the military, eliminating 3 of the 5 Red Army marshals and about 30,000 officers. It decimated the party apparatus itself,
Arresting hundreds of thousands of Stalin's own loyal functionaries.
It functioned not just to eliminate opposition, but to provide scapegoats for policy failures and ensure a constant supply of new bodies for the expanding Gulag economy.
And here we hit that scientific paradox you mentioned. How could a system that was so fundamentally repressive, killing its own experts, simultaneously drive groundbreaking technical advancements like the nuclear program and Sputnik?
It's so bizarre. It imprisoned scientists, yet prioritized technical knowledge. They did it through the Shirashka system, special NKVD prisons where arrested scientists and engineers were forced to continue their research under guard.
Think of that contradiction. Individuals like Sergei Korolev, the future chief designer of the Soviet space program, were literally imprisoned while solving complex engineering problems for the state.
They needed expertise, but they couldn't trust the experts.
Meanwhile, the man who theoretically should have led the nation was in exile. Trotsky was expelled in 1929. Why did Stalin exile him then instead of just executing him?
The sources suggest it was highly strategic. In 1929, executing the architect of the Red Army would have seemed too extreme to many in the party.
So exile appeared moderate.
It looked moderate, it avoided unnecessary complications with foreign powers, and crucially, it rendered Trotsky a useful external enemy who could be blamed for any and all domestic problems.
But exile didn't silence him intellectually. He published monumental works, The History of the Russian Revolution, The Revolution Betrayed.
A powerful critique of the burgeoning Soviet bureaucracy. He even founded the Fourth International in 1938 to resist Stalinism.
But despite that intellectual effort, the Fourth International remained politically marginal. It failed to attract mass support. And this wasn't just a political defeat. It became a profound personal catastrophe.
Stalin systematically eliminated Trotsky's entire immediate family. His sons and daughters died or were executed, demonstrating the absolute borderless reach of his power.
The final act took place in Mexico City, a sophisticated operation run by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police.
After a crude, failed attempt in May 1940, a more complex plan was executed. Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist and NKVD agent, spent months infiltrating Trotsky's household.
He gained his trust through a long-term operation.
And on August 20th, 1940, Mercader struck Trotsky in the head with an ice axe concealed in his raincoat. Trotsky died the next day.
And Mercader served 20 years in a Mexican prison, never revealing his true loyalty.
Until his release in 1960. He traveled secretly to the USSR, where he was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, a final, chilling confirmation of state sponsorship.
So we've covered the entire brutal arc. Let's reiterate the key modern lesson here. The conflict demonstrates how organizational and institutional control Stalin's bureaucratic mastery will almost always trump personal qualities like charisma and intellectual brilliance.
Especially in centralized systems. And that tension is still active today. You see it in the contrast between charismatic, founder-style leaders like Mao and the emphasis on institutionalized rule, like what we see in Xi Jinping's China.
And the fundamental uncertainty around succession in non-democratic states, like a post-Putin Russia, that remains a key global issue, precisely because the formal mechanisms of power have been hollowed out.
By the same organizational dynamics that Stalin perfected.
And Stalin's control over information, the suppression of Lenin's testament, the rewriting of history, connects directly to how modern authoritarian states manage information via propaganda and internet control. The game hasn't changed, only the technology.
And we have to revisit that modernization debate. Authoritarian systems can rapidly mobilize resources because they operate without the constraints of electoral consent.
What?
But Stalin's catastrophic human costs, coupled with the Soviet system's eventual collapse, clearly suggests this rapid growth comes at the expense of long-term sustainability. You can't kill millions of your most capable people and expect the system to function forever.
And finally, there's the danger in ideological certainty. Trotsky's tragic flaw was his belief that being theoretically right would translate into political victory.
It led to his passivity at critical institutional moments. He fundamentally misread the mechanism of power.
Whereas Stalin's flaw was pure cynicism, the willingness to adopt or abandon any ideology that served his immediate power interests.
Which created a system where truth was simply whatever the state proclaimed it to be. This led to historical falsification and a systematic lack of any self-correcting mechanisms, which are essential for long-term health.
The core conclusion of this deep dive is clear. Stalin's victory stemmed primarily from his institutional control as general secretary over Trotsky's sheer brilliance. The consequence was a state that achieved rapid industrialization and military power, but at the cost of millions of lives.
And while Stalin bears vastly greater responsibility for the intensity of the terror, we have to acknowledge that both men contributed to the institutional conditions. The ban on factions, the use of state violence against political enemies that made the subsequent dictatorship possible.
Which raises an enduring question for you, the listener, as you look at emerging governance systems today.
What institutional checks must be established at the very moment a revolution or a major political change succeeds to prevent the means required for seizing power from fundamentally corrupting the revolution's original emancipatory goals?
Something to consider as you process this history. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.